Okay, first I want to apologize in advance if I mispronounce any of your guys' names. Okay. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is, this House, as Serbia, would develop closer ties with China after the expense of ties with the European Union. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Greece. And on the opposition, we have the team from South Korea. From the proposition side, our speakers are first speaker Leo, second speaker Alexia, third speaker Max, and reply speaker Alexia. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Connie, second speaker Alex, third speaker Henry, and reply speaker Alex. Okay, each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and the last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of the protected time at 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to the protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams. I now hand over the floor to our chair judge.
Sorry, you use some motion button?
Sorry.
Alright, hello, and welcome to the quarterfinals of WSDC 2024. A huge round of applause for both teams. My name is Duncan. I'll be chairing this round. I go by keeping pronouns, so please address the panel as a whole. Judging me from left to right is
Andrew from New Zealand.
Emma from Croatia.
Martin from Malaysia.
Lamina from India.
Alright, 2 quick bits of housekeeping before we begin. The first is I'll be using the gatekeeper for timing, so we'll be hearing this at 1, 7, twice at 8, 3 times at 8:15, and 8:30 we'll stop taking notes, so you might as well stop speaking. Secondly, there is a large amount of people in the audience. Please stay as quiet as possible so we can actually listen to the speaker speaking, and when other speeches that are happening, try and whisper throughout the bench. I know the online era made us talk very loudly, so try and be as quiet as possible. Are there any questions before we begin? Yes. Yes, that's very good. Alright, then without further ado, I invite the first proposition speaker to open up the debate.
Okay, Matt? Serbia applied for EU membership in 2009 and was told it would enter in 2012. That was pushed back to 2017 and now 2029. Not only is this not happening, but if it were to happen, it would be horrible for the Serbian people. A couple of points on setup. First, what does developing further ties with China look like? It looks like receiving and applying to receive more investment like FDI in terms of infrastructure or in terms of the lithium mines that currently Germany wants to basically use. Secondly, it looks like increasing trade, lowering trade barriers or tariffs on specific goods like manufactured products, EVs, or other things like that. But secondly, what does developing further ties with the EU look like? It looks like letting some more investment in from them, but also, and more importantly, like adhering more to the road to membership, right? Making the changes both economic that they want, but also the ones described in the info slide in terms of democratic changes, as well as recognize, like trying to go on the process to recognize Kosovo, etc. But the third point in setup here, and very importantly, is that this is an actor motion, no thinking. That means that what the priority in this debate should be are the interests of the Serbian people, be those their national identity and what they feel is important to them, or be those their economic interests. Three arguments from our side then. Firstly, as to why the relationship with China is one that is much more accessible to the Serbian people and comes at a much lower cost. Secondly, as to why it is a better relationship simply in terms of economics. And thirdly, Alexei will talk to you about signaling desperation and why that is so bad. Our first argument then is that China is a much more accessible relationship than the EU for Serbia, and it comes at a much lower cost. This argument will show that the relationship in terms of the money you can get from China is much more likely to end up occurring, but also that even if, no thank you, both sides get what they want, the cost of a relationship with China for the Serbian people, particularly in terms of their national identity, is much less. Why then is Serbia unlikely to be willing to make the sacrifices necessary to join the EU? Firstly, because Kosovo is key to their national identity. The most important event in Serbian history is the Battle of Kosopoli. The Serbian army stopped the Ottoman expansion. This is largely perceived as the birth of the Serbian nation and one of the most important events there. But further, it has important religious connotations, no thank you, since the Serbian king with his 12 knights, biblical allusion, stopped the Ottomans. So this is incredibly important for a largely Orthodox population. Further, a lot of Serbs have family in Kosovo, which has a large Serbian population, especially in the north. This means that recognizing Kosovo for Serbian people as independent is like castrating a part of their national identity. That's like asking the Americans to give up George Washington and the War of Independence as being part of their national identity. This means it's incredibly unlikely that the Serbian people will be willing to make these sacrifices. Notice here that the EU is unlikely to be able to drop this as a condition. Why? Because a lot of EU countries, the vast majority of them rather, have already recognized Kosovo and made this a focal point, no thank you, for something that they need Serbia to do in order to join. This means this will continue to exist as a condition, and Serbia is incredibly unlikely to be willing to meet this condition. But second, because Serbia has an incredible distrust of the international community, particularly Europe. Why? A, in terms of the bombings of Yugoslavia, largely done by NATO, largely which many European members are part of. But B, because other European countries like Greece and Spain do not recognize Kosovo as well. This means that when Europe is telling them you must recognize Kosovo in order to be in the EU, and the Serbs are like, but Spain doesn't recognize Catalonia or Kosovo, why am I being persecuted? This feeds into the idea that the international community is against Kosovo. So they have a lot of distrust against the EU, and so this is something that people don't want. Versus, we think China doesn't have these sort of demands. Primarily they want money, and they want to have influence in Europe, right? And they also, by the way, don't want to recognize Kosovo because they have their own Taiwan problem there, so that's not a big of an issue for them. Therefore, we think that it's much easier for us to access China membership rather than EU. But thirdly, because Croatia is likely to veto entry into European Union, because that's how you need unanimity in allowing for membership, and also Croatia really doesn't like Serbia because of round 2 basically. But fourthly here, in terms of the expansion fatigue of Europe, we think this is why you have people like Schulz or Macron calling to oppose new expansion of Europe, because it's at this point quite big, and the economies, no thank you for the POI, are not doing that great, so they don't want to add additional instability by expanding a lot and including new countries like Serbia. This is why EU on its own, independently of what Serbia does or doesn't do, is likely unwilling to accept Serbia as a member. What is the importance of this argument? It means two things. Firstly, that the certainty of getting the money, either from the EU or China, is much likelier on proposition. This means that people get jobs, they can start businesses, they're more able to pay their rent, they're more able to put their kids in education. This is incredibly important to people, and we have it on a much greater certainty on our side. But secondly, it means that even if people do even if Serbia does get into the EU on opposition, even if it gets more money maybe from EU as opposed to China, I don't know why that would happen, it means that the cost to Serbian national identity in terms of having to recognize Kosovo and having to give up all of these things is huge. We think that this is the priority for the Serbian people. They've shown this priority in the past. They went through months of NATO bombing of civilian infrastructure like radio stations and refugee camps in order to stay and continue their war on Kosovo. This is clearly a priority for these people. The Serbian people ousted the 2008 government that started the EU application process, was ousted by the Serbian people in 2014, and by 2020 a pro-Russian anti-EU Vučić is the person in power. Clearly the preference of Serbia, what the Serbian people think is their priority, is their national identity over whatever economic benefits opposition can give them, even if those happen. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Who is Serbia's largest trading partner in the status quo?
I'm pretty sure it's Germany at 13% of imports and exports, and the second biggest is Russia at 12% of imports and something like that of exports. I'll be talking to you about Russia there. I want to note though, in terms of the POI, I assume what they mean is that you're going to cut ties with Germany. The first thing to note here is that this is unlikely to happen in the way that they're likely to describe. Why? Because not joining the EU doesn't mean that you cut ties with Germany or all of these countries. It probably means you don't increase them, but Germany has a lot of ties with a lot of countries that aren't in the EU, that aren't in the European Union anyways. Our second argument then is that China is a much better partner than the EU economically. Why? We think the EU is bad economically for Serbia for two reasons. Firstly, because it often joins wars and conflicts that are quite bad for Serbia. As opposition flagged, Serbia gets a lot of cheap Russian gas, which is why Serbia has actually one of the lowest in the EU prices of oil right now. But if they were forced by the EU to join in sanctions or not import that, that would be very, very harmful for the Serbian people. Secondly, though, because EU means that you enter a free trade agreement, which quite messes up Serbia. Why? Because their markets are flooded. Serbia right now has a pretty thriving automobile industry. This means, though, that when they join the EU and when they join in a free trade agreement, and they can't have tariffs against importing against importing automobiles from outside, this means that they now have to compete with the Italian automobile industry, which is likely quite bad for Serbia. Versus with China, you can check the relationship. You can choose what you import or not because you have this sort of, it's bilateral. You're not opening yourself up to a free trade agreement with all of China's allies. But now I want to show you why China has very strong incentives to be good, right? It's not going to, exploit Serbia. Why? Because firstly, it has an incentive to appeal to other European countries because it wants to expand its influence in the region. Now, does it also have an incentive to exploit you as much as possible? Yes. What's the difference? Why is the former more likely? Because by expanding in all of Europe, it can get much more benefits. By squeezing Serbia dry, it can maybe get something, but a lot less than they could by expanding into Europe. It's unlikely to expand into Europe if it scares off others by exploiting Serbia. It's less likely to do that. But secondly, because Russia can hold China accountable to some degree. Russia has very strong cultural ties with Serbia and doesn't want to see its ally exploited. The importance of this is that we get much more money, much less harm to people. But secondly, I want to note that the EU is likely to compete with China over Serbia, as happened with Greece, for instance, after China started investing in it. For all of these reasons, we're incredibly proud to propose.
She, her pronouns, and my time starts in 3, 2, 1. If proposition's strategy in this round is to conflate corruption, anti-democracy, and exploitation from over-depending on China, then the first ballot already falls to us. What do we support in stance? Firstly, we support Serbia's traditional ties to the EU and oppose its increasing pivot towards China. Importantly, as it is in status quo, while we can see that Serbia is much more closely linked with the EU in comparison to China, we should recognize that Serbia maintains ties with both China and the EU. That is, Serbia still has bilateral deals with China in investment in infrastructure, energy, and industrial projects. Moreover, Serbia and China maintain a strong political connection where both countries express support for each other. For example, China supports Serbia's stance in Kosovo, and Serbia supports China's position in international forums. Secondly, it is not all that clear that opposing the motion would mean that China would cut ties with Serbia, per their own concession in their POI when they symmetrized this claim with Germany. Insofar as that we largely defend the status quo, where there's a decent balance Serbia maintains between the EU and China, the status quo is one in which Serbia is connected to the EU while maintaining political and economic ties with China. But also, China broadly has the incentive to stay connected in general with Serbia, as Serbia is a participant in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which purpose is to literally enhance connectivity and cooperation between China and participating nations. What is very clear in this comparative is that they necessarily need to sacrifice Serbia's current relationship with the EU in exchange for developing closer ties with China, and this sets a very high burden on proposition in this round, insofar as that they need to prove why Serbia's developing stronger ties with China leads to such a massive benefits that warrants dropping EU entirely. We support a continuation of Serbia's current foreign policy, which is leveraging the benefits from each partnership, where the EU maintains a strategic goal for Serbia in terms of economic integration
integration and political alignment, and China also offers substantial economic benefits with investments, and we support this balance overall. But lastly, the fact that Serbia applied for membership to the EU and has been granted EU candidate status and is the largest country that currently has EU candidate status demonstrates a number of things. Firstly, that Serbia has a clear revealed preference to join the EU in the first place. But secondly, the fact that they're in the process of negotiations with the EU and continue to receive massive financial and developmental aid from the EU means that there are constant efforts to align its policies and standards with those of the EU. Literally, the EU is currently Serbia's largest trading partner and accounting for a significant portion of Serbia's exports and imports. Part of Germany is part of the EU. Also, they receive financial support from the EU through various funds aimed at promoting economic development, infrastructural projects, government assistance, and rule of law and institutional reforms in order to help them insert themselves within the EU and meet the criteria for EU membership. Before arguments, I'm going to move on to responses. Firstly, on the point of national identity, note that I was already very clear in my hook that if proposition strategy is to conflate those two things, this falls for two reasons. Firstly, in framing, we already explained why Serbia has already an observed preference to join the EU, seeing how they applied and stayed in the application process in the first place. But secondly, it's unclear to us how the nebulous principle of identity, which is marginally impacted, given that they didn't prove how joining the EU would detriment to national identity, conceding that Kosovo is its own nation presumably doesn't negate years of history, but their burden was to prove why the economic impact and the sacrifice by cutting off the EU would be which wouldn't much more proximately affect the average individual's livelihoods, like their jobs, their industries, and the national companies that exist in Serbia. But lastly, per their POI concession, if Germany can retain trade ties in their world, China can also retain bilateral ties in our world too. The deadlock breaker is that they lose out on all the host of other economic benefits you eradicate when you cut off the EU. Before arguments, sure.
The current trade percentage balance of the current percentage of Serbian trade with China is less than 4%. Don't try and claim Chinese capital and turn the debate into nothing.
But the issue is you already proved how the EU has a much more significant role economically with Serbia within the economy right now, which is why you're sacrificing all of that within your world. How's this terrible for Serbia's economy? The thesis of this argument is that proposition's case relies on Serbia relying very heavily on China for economic growth, which definitionally makes it economically dependent on a single economy. We think that this is terrible for several reasons. One, China's economic policies and priorities do not stay stagnant, they shift, which is to say that proposition leaves Serbia vulnerable to sudden changes within China's trade policies and investment strategies. On the comparative, the EU with its massive, diverse, and stable economy offers a much more balanced and secure economic partnership. Note that the EU is literally one of the world's largest, most integrated markets. This means that Serbia is allowed its ability to diversify its trade partners and reduce economic risks associated with over-dependence on China, which means more stability and long-term growth opportunities. But two things under this as well. This also means that Serbia is much less vulnerable to China's potential economic downturns, whereas Serbia has plenty of alternatives on our side. But secondly, the EU offers Serbia access to cutting-edge technology like research, innovation, which is potential for long-term economic growth, which they never really contested. But secondly, the EU provides substantial structural and cohesion funds to member states as well as candidate countries, such as Serbia in this motion, to support economic development and infrastructural projects, and these funds are often grants rather than loans, which do not add to the national debt. The comparative is simple. Crucially, China's investment in their world, on the other hand, often come in the form of loans, which have significantly increased Serbia's debt and burden and leads to financial dependence. Moreover, the EU's investment comes with stringent standards for transparency, which Chinese investment absolutely do not have, which make corruption and shady bilateral agreements a lot more common in their world. But thirdly, and much more crucially, the over-reliance on China significantly reduces Serbia's bargaining power in negotiations. With few alternative sorts of investment and trade, Serbia is likely forced to accept less favorable deals with China. That is, proposition has no fiat to say that Serbia will stay the same in their world, insofar as that the reason why we have access to those benefits in the first place is because we have a large amount of leverage and power in our world. They lose that entirely. Cross-apply our previous analysis on China's debt trap diplomacy, where China can leverage Serbia's debt to exert political and economic influence, which massively compromises Serbia's sovereignty and decision-making capacity. But the conclusion is this, that this isn't a debate about which actor is better, China or the EU. We're very happy to have that debate as well, but this debate is fundamentally a question of which side allows Serbia to have increased freedom, autonomy, and access to option. In addition to losing support from the EU that Serbia has maintained until now, they also lose the crucial bargaining power that Serbia has. Second argument, why it diminishes Serbia's international standing. Firstly, recognize that the EU places a huge emphasis on democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law. In contrast, Look at China's political model, which does not prioritize these values at all. We see this in the world right now. Their genocide against Uyghurs, threatening to invade Ukraine, not threatening to invade Taiwan rather, supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the list goes on. Aligning solely with China means that Serbia is locked out of Western political and economic circles that value these principles and stand firmly against authoritarian regimes, which is probably much more important for the Serbian national identity than the nebulous principle that they forward in first. But secondly, independent of other Western countries, the EU has massive influence within the Balkan nations and play a crucial role in maintaining regional stability that they lose out on. China, on the flip, does not have equal influence over the region, meaning you need to weigh out both the powers that Serbia loses in aligning with China and Serbia's partnerships with neighboring EU states. But thirdly, Serbia's long-term goal is literally to join the EU, which is why there are constant negotiations taking place within the EU funding Serbia and providing them with all these benefits to meet the standards for EU membership. Cutting ties with the EU definitionally destroys Serbia's shot at this and derails potential EU accession, losing out on all of the benefits that they can gain currently, plus the benefits that they would gain from joining the EU in the first place. But lastly, Serbia doesn't just lose out on the EU when they cut ties with them. This has significant implications for Serbia's standing in other organizations like the UN, WTO, NATO, insofar as the EU is a massive player within these organizations on our side. On our side, Serbia is able to engage in constructive dialogues with these organizations, as NATO literally has a standing offer to Serbia to enter these dialogue programs. But again, proposition forces Serbia out of the circles and limits its options further, and we can never stand for this on opposition. Very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the first opposition speaker, then I'd like the second part to extend the proposition administration.
I'm just going to move this down if you're okay. I think the team opposition is trying to narrow this debate into something that is not just uncharitable, but literally non-debatable, at the point where they try to have their cake and eat it too. Because their model, or their stance, or whatever you want to call it, tells you that they want to keep relationships with China, and they spend 2 minutes defensively saying why they're still going to have it, and it still exists, and it still suffices, at which point I think they firstly concede that China must be very valuable at the point where they want to keep it under their side of the house. But secondly, they don't actually engage with the fact that in order for Serbia to actually be able to increase its ties with the EU, or at least maintain them, it cannot also have strong relationships with China. Those have to decrease because China is a direct competitor of the EU. And therefore, there is a significant trade-off that opposition is trying to escape. They're not engaging with the fact that you do have to actually increase you do have to increase Chinese influence under our side, Chinese relationships under our side, and they have to decrease those relationships under their side of the house. But I think that the reason why they do this is first because they realize that China is actually quite valuable. And I think that if it is the case that they support things like more investments as part of the BRI, this falls under our side of the house, our side which says that we want to continue the BRI, we want to continue having economic relationships and investment with China. This isn't something that they can claim just because it happens in the status quo. But the second thing that I want to note is that necessarily way for them to be able to claim that they are going to try to increase their ties with the EU, this has to mean that Serbia has to also try to get that EU membership. That is the whole point. And what they fail to engage with is that that does come at a cost. This is why they try to just brush off our argument on like national identity and Kosovo. They tell you that, your loss of identity is not impacted. What does that mean? We told you all the way from first that in order, no thank you, for your side of the house to increase ties with the EU and therefore try and get that membership a lot more. And by the way, make it more likely that it was in 2009 or 2012, you necessarily have to concede that as Serbia, you recognize Kosovo. But Leo told you in his speech that that is very hard to do and it's very unlikely to be done. Because firstly, people have family in Kosovo from Serbia. They don't want to recognize something that is part of them. This is really, really important. It disenfranchises people, secondly. It makes them feel very lost in terms of identity. This is extremely harmful for Serbians, and they're unlikely to do it. And even if they do, this comes at a massive cost at the point where they feel completely lost as to who they are. They have to make a massive concession that is indeed comparable to, for example, the US, like not recognizing, George Washington or whatever. We told you then that this is a huge concession, no thank you, that it's really, really harmful and that Serbia is unlikely to want to make, and that if it does, it comes at a massive cost. The second thing that I want to address then is then this very, very last thing that we get in the last 30 seconds of their speech about the WTO and relationships with democracy. The first thing that I want to know is that China is in the WTO and actually has a lot more voting power in the WTO, which means that at the point in which you increase relationships with China under our side of the house, this means that you actually have a really big actor with really big voting power in that same organization. I think this sounds fantastic when China has a bigger market than the entirety of the EU combined. This is so much better under our side of the house. You shoot yourselves in the foot with that, South Korea. But the second thing to note is that democracy doesn't come from foreign pressure at the point where they try to claim that suddenly you're going to get better democracy reforms. This simply isn't true. What's more likely to happen is that when Serbia feels so much pressure from other EU countries to now turn democratic, they go on the defense. They start feeling very disenfranchised, and that's when they're less likely to make reforms, because all of this is being made contingent on them joining the EU and then being pressured by a bunch of countries that aren't even allowing them into their own union and organization. I think then that democratic reforms are so much more likely under their side of the house. But they don't even prove why that is so much more important than all of the economic benefits that you can gain from our side of the house when you do increase Chinese relationships. Because note that right now, the EU is trying to make deals with Serbia in order to have access to their lithium. But at the same time, the EU is refusing to let Serbia in. And the fact that they're a candidate doesn't prove that they're very likely to be let in. But rather, history empirically has shown us that the EU is blocking Serbia from joining. This is why they keep postponing it. The fact that Croatia has the ability to consistently veto and block this Serbian government from joining the EU. All of these are indications that, no thank you, honestly, the EU is just going to be able to keep bossing Serbia around and at the same time have access to its lithium? Are you kidding me? No, our side is one that says we're done with this patronizing being bossed around. It's time for Serbia to actually be able to expand its economic influence with a partner that honestly doesn't make democratic reforms a basis or a criterion for them to be able to develop. And secondly, one that doesn't force them to compromise their national identity. So I think both on economy and both on the extent to which people feel united and don't have to sacrifice something really crucial to their identity, our side of the house is one which actually better improves that. But before I move on,
We defend the status quo. Your burden is, as the motion says, closer ties with China at the expense of ties with the EU. Why choose a partner that is only 4% of your exports while the EU is a majority of our exports?
oh my God, that is literally the motion. The motion says that we want to increase the 4% to a much bigger percentage. What are you talking about? You're the status quo, which basically means that A, you can't stand for the whole things that you said at the start, that you keep relationship with China, because clearly in the status quo those aren't big enough. And secondly, necessarily for your side of the house to want to increase ties with the European Union, to want to get that membership, you have to have less China, because these are two competing actors and you can't have both. Don't try to narrow this debate into something that is so minimal. Lastly then, the thing that I want to address is that they tell you that Chinese money comes in the form of loans, and that's really bad because you have less bargaining power. The first thing that I want to note is that they don't explain why this debt trapping game is likely to happen, we already know that China isn't doing this in places like Hungary, in places like Greece, where it's funding, for example, the Piraeus port. It's actually trying to appeal to other European countries by not debt trapping them, exactly because it wants to expand its influence in Europe. And so it tries to seem like a really nice guy, and that is why this is very unlikely. But secondly, as opposed to what, right? The EU has the same capacity to debt trap you. I think our country is a great indication as to as we've been in debt for literally ever, and Germany isn't allowing us to do better with that. So honestly, I don't see why the EU alternative is better. Our own argument then as to why Serbia trying to join and form ties with the EU damages its national image on a global scale because of the EU's exploitative stance. Why is the EU clearly resistant and exploitative? Two reasons. The first is that there's a bloc of countries that literally hate Serbia and will do anything to undermine it. A, in terms of places like Croatia or Slovenia, because of the Yugoslav past, or B, in terms of countries like France or Spain, which want to virtue signal something about democracy, all of which are more than 30% of the EU's GDP. But secondly, they try to indefinitely postpone this, right? The fact that this kept moving from 2009, 2012, 2029, this means that it has, and it will always try to block Serbia in one way or another. Why is this catastrophic for its national image? Three reasons. The first is that it's undermined Serbia's sovereignty. People feel disenfranchised when they're faced with so much resistance. Honestly, Serbia seems really desperate, and that's really bad for its image, and people don't like that. But secondly, it ruins ties with Russia. When you seem desperate for the EU, which Russia is against, you're less likely to have Russian backing. And this is important when for Serbia, Russia is a really important actor for which they get cheaper gas, cheaper resources. Honestly, Russia's kind of like Serbia's dad, and you're losing that, and you're angering them, and this is really bad. But thirdly, it creates a cycle of dependency on the EU, and this is even worse for the image, but also allows them to be exploited more, to be postponed more. This is catastrophic for Serbia. We are with the side of the Serbian people, and we are on the side of development proposition.
Alright, if I speak in this phone, can you hear? Wonderful. This Greece team's wordplay is quite clever, so let's be clear on burdens. Our claim was that we do not need to defend Serbia completely cutting ties with China. We can defend the status quo, where Serbia, as an EU candidate, has ties with both China and EU, but is obviously closer and more aligned with the EU. It is their burden in this debate to prove why they would go even further than that, the status quo, to get even more closer with China and drop EU completely. But more importantly, check your flow. None of our arguments are contingent on us continuing ties with China. It is rather the opposite, that over-dependence on China, which they exclusively get, is what is precisely horrible. So I'm remarkably unsure why this team Greece chose to make this a quibble in the first place. The first thing I want to do at the speech is deal with their argument that China is far more accessible than EU. The first thing I'll note is just let's examine the ways that empirically the EU is already benefiting Serbia in the status quo. What we pointed to is firstly the economic benefits, that Serbia has significant access to the EU's single market, that the EU is Serbia's key trading partner as they concede, that Serbia's export to the EU has been rapidly growing since the 2010s, that individual EU member states like Germany and Italy are Serbia's most important trade partners, especially for agricultural exports. These are all things that Team Greece needs to let go just in pursuit of increased Chinese development on their side of the house. But we also pointed to things like collaborative research and innovation projects that do help Serbia's economy grow into the long term, like EU recently signing a memorandum of understanding literally like 5 or 3 days ago, which does facilitate a partnership with Serbia on things like electric vehicles, things like battery change and sustainable development of raw materials for research and exports. China has no incentive to care about Serbia into the long term. That is why we've proven to you that even if not perfect, even if not Serbia is a candidate, it is still accessible into the status quo. But secondly, if these empirical pieces of evidence are not enough, here are the structural reasons why the EU does have incentives to cooperate with Serbia. Firstly, because EU nations and corporations benefit directly from Serbian agricultural imports and expanding to Serbia through things like commercial development as well. So it is not necessarily just benefiting Serbia, it also benefits EU nations themselves, even if Serbia isn't necessarily a member in the status quo. But secondly, that into the long term, their own concession is that EU wants Serbia to become more democratic. They want Serbia to change its stance on Kosovo. That is why EU in the status quo, as Serbia as a candidate, wants to actively make it a non-member ally. There are precedents of the past, and thank you, of EU caring about countries that are not necessarily members because they want them to be more favorable of EU into a long term as well. Here's the weighing then. Accessibility is a non-argument. It is a contingent argument. It is entirely contingent on that accessibility actually leading to increased benefits. If we prove then that China is not a good actor, especially to be over-dependent on, accessibility is actually a bad thing because you're just getting more accessibility to even more exploitation, even more human rights abuses. But second, even if accessibility is an a priori good, given that we already proved why a sufficient level of accessibility is already ensured by the EU in the status quo, they need to prove why this marginal increase in accessibility is round winning. Given this, their argument in the thank you on why the EU is not a good actor is primarily that the EU engages in conflicts which is bad. Like, hello, China is about to engage in a large conflict with Taiwan and has been significantly funding Russia. There are two deadlock breakers on this then. One, that EU is broadly far more against conflicts, while China is far less considerate of human rights abuses and conflicts if it means that they can get their strategic roles. But second, that EU makes collaborative decision making, while China is literally making conflicts and political decisions on the will of Xi Jinping himself. That is why we're far more likely to get less volatility in the ways in which EU engages in conflicts compared to China engaging in conflicts. I want to now bring back the reasons why overdependence on China then is terrible for Serbia's economy. I'll note that none of these mechanisms actually got a proper response from P2. Firstly, that China's economic policies and priorities are far more volatile than the EU because it has an integrated market, which means that we have far less risk and far less, we have far less risks and they have far less diversification. Secondly, that this is vulnerable to China's potential economic downturns, while EU has multiple member states, which means you can get more alternatives. Third, that the EU offers Serbia's unique access to technology, research, and innovation. I'll take you after this. That China has no incentive to because China cares about short-term and its own development, while EU necessarily does have to care about Serbia, especially Serbia is likely to be part of the EU into the future. But finally, and most importantly, China gives loans, which oftentimes has strings attached for infrastructure and debt, while the EU gives grants and also has far more transparency, while a vast majority of Chinese corporations do not need to comply with standards of transparency. But finally, independent of the incentives of China, that they just get empirically far less bargaining power, especially if they want to increase China's influence from 4% to cover the holes of EU absence, which is a massive reach, which is far less bargaining power on their side of the house. Before I move on to bringing back our second argument, which is another independent path for you to cast about for team opposition, I'm going to skip here one.
To be clear, your case relies on bilateral relations with countries like Germany and Italy, not the European Union as the motion would suggest, right?
The point is that even in the status quo, where there isn't necessarily EU integration of Serbia, where Serbia isn't a member, Serbia is still benefiting vastly from these EU countries and EU corporations through things like FDI and things like bilateral trade. It is your side that risks all of this just to be over-dependent on China, and I think like 5 minutes and 50 seconds of my speech literally was about why China's over-dependence is just horrible. The second thing I want to point out then is why this is horrible for Serbia's international standing. That'll also neatly clash with their second argument or third argument on why this is horrible for Serbia's reputation. That the EU's emphasis on democratic governance and rule of law is far better than China's comparative of things like genocide and invasion of Taiwan and conflicts. But second, that the EU's influence in the Balkans is something that Serbia ought to prioritize. We still yet to hear a response from Team Greece on this political international point, and I think this is very important for Serbia, especially going forward into the future. Final argument then on how proposition harms Serbian people on the ground. Firstly, pivoting solely to China is likely to massively exaggerate wealth inequality, that Chinese investments oftentimes only focus on large infrastructure that do not evenly benefit all regions or socio-economic groups within Serbia. Contrast this to EU's approach of broader trading relations and an emphasis on long-term sustainable economic development that is far better for people on the ground. Second, that Chinese projects oftentimes employ Chinese workers as opposed to local laborers, which stifles job creation and economic opportunities for Serbian citizens. But even if Serbian workers are employed, there's no compliance to labor standards at all because China wants to cut as many costs as possible while EU has far more checks and balances. Thirdly, that China does not need to care about having stringent standards for loans, since increased debt that a country owes to them gives them far more leveraging power. Crucially then, an increased national debt definitionally results in higher taxes, which disproportionately affects middle, lower income populations in Serbia. An increased debt also strains public finances, leading to cuts in things like essential public services like healthcare, education, and social welfare, which again harms the most vulnerable. But fourthly, Chinese projects do not care about things like environmental standards, which has empirically led to environmental degradation, including things like pollution, deforestation. These disproportionately affect lower class populations who do not have the means to move out of these polluted regions. Finally, there is massive democratic backsliding when Serbia entirely relies on China and sanctions anything the Serbian states want to do. This emboldens the Serbian state to adapt even more authoritarian policies, such as the crackdown of dissent and reduced freedom of press. This is round-winning, because their own weighing in P1 is that the people on the ground is most important. So independent of economics and politics or international relations, it is Team Greece that forgets the most vulnerable people on the ground in Serbia. Opposed.
I'd like to thank second off, I'm ready. And I invite third cross.
The weirdness of opposition's case unravels when you realize it's not really about EU relations or anything like that. It is about bilateral trade with Italy and Germany. Note what they do. They tell you that Serbia trades with these countries, and that is true, but that trade happens on a bilateral basis. It has nothing to do with close treaty ties. It has nothing to do, therefore, with emotion. And you know why we know this? Because a lot of other countries where China invests in, like Pakistan, like Kenya, like most of the world, to be honest, which also bilaterally trade with Germany and Italy, because this is how economies work. They trade with each other. They have never established the exclusivity of the bilateral ties. I think this therefore means that what they're talking about on trade, what they're talking about losing the 12%, however large Germany is, doesn't manifest. I'll talk to you about three things. First of all, national identity, and how on their best case, when you join the EU and you make these concessions, that is catastrophic, what we told you since first. Second of all, why you can't have both, and why, very importantly, you can't join the EU and continue ties under both sides, and that takes out all of their case. And third of all, about how China is actually better economically. But let's talk to you about national identity, because opposition one flippantly dismissed this as vague and nebulous. Well, national identity is very important, as it is the literal stated preference of people, of the Serbian people. They were willing to fight a war to keep Kosovo. They were willing to undergo months of NATO bombing and of EU bombing, by the way, of civilian infrastructure, of caravans, of refugees, to continue having Kosovo, because they just choose to prioritize it that much, because that is where their family lives. You see graffiti all across Serbia saying Kosovo is Serbia. That is the stated preference of the people. And by the way, they tell you, oh, but they applied to join the EU, so clearly they want that. Wrong. They voted 55% for Vucic, the candidate who cares nothing about EU, who cares much more about protecting the Serb community of northern Kosovo. The candidate who has stalled negotiations because they're not going anywhere, because the EU and Serbia have fundamentally different interests. And why is this much more important? First of all, it is much more certain. You will always be Serbian. You will always be, you will always care about your family, your relatives, your community. community in Kosovo. Economic benefits by definition are uncertain, by definition are subject to trade flows. And second of all, we think that it's just much more important to the people because look, yes, there are good things which happen for material welfare, but your identity supersedes that. It is what you always consider first. If you're poor, if you're rich, if you lose your job, if you're not, you are always Serbian. That is always what unites you with others. Then, why can't they have China? Because very simply, we think they're defending the status quo, where there is very little China, and they aren't getting any investment. And by the way, to the extent to which they might try to get more Chinese investment, I think this is a good reason why the EU, and we also gave you 4 reasons as to why EU membership is not happening, both from the Serbian point of view and from the EU point of view. The vetoes from Croatia, the fact that they have structural expansion fatigue, which means even the big dogs in the EU, like Olaf Scholz, like Macron in France, don't want to have this expansion happening. And by the way, this is why funding has stalled and will continue to stall. Because insofar as Serb membership is not a likely outcome, the German electorate can't expect their government to be giving away their money to a country in the Balkans which won't join, and which is why it's decreasing and will continue to decrease and eventually stop because it doesn't happen. What this means is that any of the benefits of their relationship with the EU currently or in the future are contingent on them having shown why membership is likely. But they have at no point even tried to do that. We gave you 4 reasons as to why it doesn't manifest, and those are 4 reasons as to why opposition loses. Cool. Very clearly though, the benefits of bilateral trade can still remain. Therefore, you can still trade with Germany, etc. Now, Op2 tries to give you 2 reasons as to why you would want to join. The first is that they benefit off of Serbian agriculture. Reality check, the EU has the comparative advantage. French farmers are much more efficient. If they were to join the EU, what would happen is French dumping, which would mean as Serbia, you will lose a lot of your agriculture because the EU can sell you cheaper. Therefore, you lose your jobs currently. That is very bad. And also, why does the EU care that much about Serbian agriculture? It's tiny, they're doing fine. And second of all, they tell you that the EU wants to help Kosovo. That is exactly why it will never manifest. These aren't reasons as to why expansion will happen. It is reasons why expansion will not. I will take the point.
If Serbia completely cuts ties with the EU and is dominantly trading with China, why will EU countries remain incentives to continue bilateral trade and investment with Serbia?
Because, guys, capitalism. I am a German company. I want to have to buy Serbian, I don't know what Serb exports, we gave you I don't know. I want to buy Serb lithium. I will buy that lithium. I will try to do that. Trade isn't controlled so much by governments. And by the way, this doesn't matter with the EU because EU is about joining the common market, not about having bilateral relations. They fundamentally don't understand what they are trying to get and what the people of Serbia have fundamentally rejected. Let's talk to you then about economic benefits. First of all, they talk to you about anti-corruption and democratization. We think, first of all, this works with the cutting of funds. This is how they did it in Hungary and failed. This means that you either get pro-democracy or if you get money, these are mutually exclusive. But let's be honest, this also creates very pernicious incentives because when you're the opposition in Serbia and you know that the development funding is contingent on corruption, you have an incentive not to expose that corruption because then you're losing all of that money. In this way, corruption becomes a national priority when it is contingent on EU funding and you will lose that. Therefore, you get much less anti-corruption and accountability. And you know why? By the way, because the Serbian democracy didn't come from the EU. It came when the Serb people threw down Milosevic. It came when organizations like Otpor actually held the government accountable. You get none of that. You are patronizing the Serbian people by telling them democracy needs to come from abroad, from the same abroad which bombed them into damnation. Then they tell you about over-reliance on Russia, on China. First of all, we already gave you 2 good reasons in our first speech as to why China will actually be much more accountable. The fact that Russia, its most important military ally, has strong incentives to protect Serbia. And second of all, it doesn't want to create a bad image. And you know why we know this? Because when China is trying to expand in the Balkans, it is doing so very responsibly. It is doing it by building up Piraeus into a much better port and investing in its infrastructure. It is doing this by building large factories in Hungary which give jobs to people because it is trying to expand and it is responsible in doing that because it wants to attract more countries, not just small Serbia. And also, when was Europe better? You want to talk about reliance? What about joining the euro? What about giving complete monetary sovereignty to a central bank which cares about German economy, which is doing much worse than the Serbian one, and will therefore cut interest rates to stop inflation there, inflation which we don't get here. Why? Because the gas comes from Gazprom and the gas is cheap. That is all of what they are losing when they are surrendering their sovereignty to Europe. Then they talk to you about China having a bad economic ties that we get from second. First of all, I don't see why Germany would be doing any different. If you have large German multinationals buying your lithium, they will also probably bring executives from Germany. This means this is not particularly exclusive. Second of all, we don't care if China doesn't want that development to happen in an equitable or environmental fashion. We still have accountability from the Serbian government, which cares for its people, which will want to limit environmental degradation, etc. Lastly, China is just a downright better economy from Europe. It is more diversified. It has more things. It has industry. It has agriculture. It has services. It is doing better on things like electric vehicles. It is doing better on things like research. It just publishes more research papers than Europe because it funds these things more. It is so large and it is functionally a common market in and of itself. We think it is therefore more diverse, more stable. And do you know why we know this? Because it is currently facing 6% growth. Europe has stagnated to minus 0.25 in the past year. For all of these reasons, China is the much better partner for Serbia. We stand on the side of the Serb people, proud to propose.
I start whenever? Start in 3, 2, 1. The other side still doesn't meet the burden of what the motion gave them. Alex from the beginning clarified that especially in this motion, you have to take the burden on which, why, and proving how you would actually take the proper transition of completely flipping your economy and relying more on China, who is only 4% of the consumer of our exports compared to the EU. The other side tried to find loopholes to this, such as, but bilateral trade agreements work, that often Germany and Italy would still trade. But that literally directly cuts into their own case as to how China can also be a very good actor. If their whole case, even because first and second conceded that they want to make China their main actor, the main trading partner, then obviously the idea of still wanting to have Germany and Italy clearly shows that they even themselves don't trust China. So then 2 questions I want to ask. First on the clash of economic development, and then second on the idea of political stuff regarding national identity and the people. So first, let's talk about why China comparatively is just a worse actor than the EU, as many reasons why. First of all, we already told you that China's exports and Serbia's exports very much overlap. Things such as specialization in electrical machines, cars and stuff, engines and motors for cars, right? And metal ores. These are things that both sides tend to specialize in. There's a reason why China is only 4% of Serbia. It's because there isn't too much trade for. But second of all, China has a history of providing scammy trade deals, loan traps such as in Sri Lanka, African countries owing combined $20 billion to China, but also swarming countries with scammy gambling and casino businesses. The reason why when you guys went to malls and, for example, taxis, when you saw so many Chinese characters with millions of dollars basically going up and down, is because they usually swarm countries with these scammy businesses. But then they say China wouldn't exploit these countries because of reputation. But dog, what reputation does China have? They commit genocide. They help Ukraine with, they help Russia invade Ukraine. But also the idea of, for example, screwing over Africa and South Asian countries. They don't rely on reputation to go into these countries. They rely on the idea that they are stronger, that these countries need them, and they will slowly encroach into these countries. But second reason as to why they wouldn't exploit was that they're close ties. They have close, Serbia has a close ties to Russia, and that's why they wouldn't take this risk. Russia doesn't care if China exploits Serbia at the end of the day. For example, because Russia has seen, for example, China do horrible things to other countries in Africa that they were close allies with, they didn't do anything about it, for example, in Angola. So we think that they usually tend to compete on the idea of who can exploit countries better anyways. In the end, they don't give the structural reason as to why Russia would care, except that apparently Russia is Serbia's daddy. I think that's more patronizing to the Serbian people. But then third of all, this idea of China is just economically not the best after COVID. For example, they have their own housing housing bubble pop. They also have unemployment skyrocketing amongst young people. That's more of a reason why, as he told you, that they would often put their own workers in Serbia instead of, for example, allowing Serbians to have more jobs. But third of all, China is politically unstable. For example, helping Ukraine also led to them having more sanctions affecting their own trade partners. But also the idea that they're planning to quote-unquote invade Taiwan by 2027, as she said. Why have one of her major trading partners be someone that is so politically unstable? These are many reasons as to why we told you that this idea of not just why trading with China is not a good thing, but this isn't the only big problem with their side. They needed to prove the burden as to why flipping their economy completely to China being the main partner was a huge harm, would not be a harm for their country, for Serbia, and they never proved that risk. So then on a comparative level, why did we tell you, why is EU just much better? We gave you many reasons why. I'll just go over them really quickly. Things such as, for example, they receive most of their FDIs from the EU. They already do on a lot of innovative projects. But also, a lot of the assertions coming from the other side does not make sense. P3 says, oh, but apparently funding has been decreasing. No more, just not true. If you did your prepare motion regarding, like for example, reconciliation stuff, well, you also know that, for example, EU and Serbia has been getting better with their relations. They even 5 days ago, they had a summit regarding, for example, FDIs and increasing that. But second of all, they don't only trade and invest in Serbia because they think that, oh, they might be a potential member. It's because Serbia gives a lot of good stuff back. I told you the main things that they export, such as regarding motors and engines, but also things such as metal ores and electrical machines. These are things that EU actively wants, and that's the reason why they're trading. But the main attack and the loophole that they try to smuggle into is the idea that like Germany and Italy will still trade. Number one, Italy and Germany actively working through they actively work through the EU anyways. They will still trade under our side. But second of all, these FDIs are usually directly from the EU, meaning for example, this idea Germany and Italy continuing to fund these FDIs will not be the same under their side. But third of all, if you still want to rely on Italy and Germany as your main trading partner, then you're cutting into your own case of wanting China to be your main partner. That's the reason why, again, it shows that even they themselves don't trust China. But this is not the only thing. We told you on the macro level, on the economic levels, that we actually do much better. But also on the micro level, they never engaged in our third argument as to how it helps the people on the ground, the local people. We gave you 6 mechs as to why it helps the people on the ground, and there was no engagement regarding this. Number one, it creates wealth inequality because Chinese investment focus on large institutions like companies and governments. And second of all, Chinese companies employ Chinese workers as opposed to local labor. Number 3, China especially doesn't care about transparency. Often debt traps continue to exist. But fourth of all, more debt, higher taxes which impact the poor, but also especially environmental degradation, which tends to be a common problem when China tends to invest in countries. But at last, the idea of democracy, that often this tends to backslide, and it's not a good thing. We told you these are many reasons as to why on the ground, local level, on the micro economic level, that these people are very much harmed, and there was no engagement much from the other side whatsoever. So then on weighing, we told you that they need to all we have to do was defend the status quo. That we are okay with, for example, China only being 4% of the people that actually consume the exports of Serbia. That is a good thing. We don't have to defend the world in which we have to try to get China and, for example, EU anyways. That we are good as long as EU is the majority trading partner with Serbia, and that is a good thing. We think that for those reasons, a lot of the stuff under winning angles of how China comparatively is a better trading partner, again, does not stand because they don't abide by their own burden, which is set by the motion. But before that, yes.
Trading partners are not zero-sum. Increasing trade with China by 5% doesn't mean that 5% comes from somewhere else that the world works. Of course, the motion means we stop trying to join the EU. But please tell us why getting more trade from China means you get less from China.
Okay, when you say that, for example, develop closer ties with China at the expense of ties with the European Union, that means that you're cutting other people because you must have done something that is so egregious that the EU does not want to trade with you as much. So that means that it is indeed zero-sum, and you will get less of stuff from other European Union countries. So making that clear, let's move into the second clash about political stuff regarding national identity. I think regarding national identity over Kosovo, I don't think it's that important in today's round because number one, we support what Serbia is doing at the moment, keeping EU as the main trading partner while not exactly being a member. This means they don't have to concede on the aspects of Kosovo. We think that in the long run, sure, even if we take on the burden of trying to prove that they will be members, I think there are many ways to do so. We think that in the long run, the nationalism around Kosovo will die out as more and more progressives are coming in, especially in the rise in Serbia. But also, often these hateful nationalistic rhetorics are short-term due to relying on rational emotions of the people. P3 says that the current president was basically voted in by 55% and doesn't care about the EU. but he does care about the EU as long as they don't have to concede on the things regarding their national identity. That he still wants to actively trade with EU, and that is something that he has abided by. But second of all, see how the margins of victory for this president has been decreasing as time goes by? This nationalistic run eventually will die out, just like what happened in Cyprus regarding their territorial conflicts with Greece and Turkey, that they conceded in order to join the EU. For example, Slovenia and Croatia over the Bay of Piran, that they also conceded in order to join the EU. But then the third argument really came from the other side. This idea that Russia backing is so important, especially because of cheap oil. Again, we told you that in the end, Serbia can still find other trading partners regarding oil, but Russia wouldn't care anyways. So then on weighing, the two winning angles that we told you, actually three, is that number one, on a macro level, we do economically just much better because the other side has not proved their burden. But number two, on a local, on the ground level, regarding the people, we do much better. But also at last, regarding national identity, again, we do much better because we still keep it while having the economic benefits. More than proud to oppose. All right, may I start? Our strategy was threefold in this debate. First, to prove that EU is an important actor for Serbia, that the EU does grant Serbia significant access to its market, that the EU is Serbia's key trading partner, that it empirically does provide significant FDI and collaborative research and innovation programs for Serbia. Their only response is that this is symmetric because of capitalism. What? If China is already providing all of this infrastructure, if Chinese corporations are already dominating Serbia's telecommunications and energy sectors, the EU has no incentive to further invest. Their own concession is that these are actors that are mutually exclusive in P2 when convenient. So this is an extremely greedy Team Greece team that wants to say we can get the EU through bilateral trades as well, but we exclusively get China. But if it is true that they do not need to risk cutting ties with the EU, what is the impact of their case? Because according to my tracking and flow, the entirety of the first argument of Team Greece was that the EU is not accessible, that the EU is not a good actor, and therefore China is necessary. This already wins us the debate, because our burden was defending the status quo, where even if Serbia is not an EU member, it has benefited significantly through various economic relationships with EU nations. They clearly never proved to you why that trade-off, even if not a complete trade-off, of significantly losing all of this was worth it for China. But even if you don't believe this, our second path to victory was completely independent. That over-reliance on China, especially if they want to massively increase the Chinese relationship and influence from a mere 4%, is horrible for Serbia, independent of whether EU is good for Serbia. Their only response is that the over-reliance on EU is also bad. This is remarkably shallow, because we give you 4 structural reasons exclusively why specific over-reliance on China is bad. 1, that China's economic policies and priorities are far more volatile than the EU, as it is a single actor which increases risk and reduces diversification, while the EU has a broader common market. Second, that it is far more vulnerable to China's potential economic downturns as a single actor, while EU is comparatively less stringent. Third, that China gives loans while EU gives grants. We give you 2 crucial deadlock breakers then in terms of incentive. That 1, EU cares about Serbia into the long term, especially as firstly it is far more proximate to Serbia, which means that the influences of Serbia's economy and political outcomes also influences many member nations within the EU, but also as Serbia is a potential candidate for the EU, so it needs to care that Serbia is sustainably developing into the long term. China has none of these incentives. Secondly, that the EU cares about transparency, while China's corporations give pernicious loans that damage the lives of the most vulnerable on the ground. Ultimately, the only grounds remaining for Team Greece is that this antagonizes Russia and how Russia views Serbia. even this was a win for team opposition. Because even if we antagonize Russia, what we've proven to you is that the EU is a far more important actor for Serbia's international standing and political power. That one, EU's emphasis on democratic governance and rule of law was far better, even if that came at the cost of China and Russian relationship. Second, that the EU's influence in the Balkans, such as NATO, WTO, and UN, even if they can combat, for instance, WTO, is far more important than the Serbia actively preserving its quote-unquote national reputation for the Russia. Our final path to victory was then our third argument. Because even if you believe all of their material in terms of national preference, in terms of preserving culture, we weighed that oftentimes this will diminish largely people on the ground's lives, but also quality of life, even if they're alive. We've proven to you that this exaggerates wealth inequality, which received no response. That oftentimes it will lead to job loss and less economic opportunities for Serbian citizens, which received no response. Thirdly, that things like criminally high and pernicious loans with debt traps increases leveraging power, which is horrible for people on the ground because there's increased taxes, which also influences middle, lower income populations. This received no response. That fourthly, this does actively damage the environment, which also received no response, which is horrible for smaller and more vulnerable people that have less economic mobility and the ability to move around within these regions in Serbia. For all of these reasons, this has been a clearest ballot for team opposition, Team Korea.
Opposition lies, or rather, they're afraid, because all of their funding and their economy argument and their democratization stuff is contingent on membership. It is contingent because the EU, to collectively want to give money to Serbia, has to believe that it's going to incentivize it to join. But the EU knows by now, after 20 years, that Serbia won't join. That is why it has stopped giving money to countries like Turkey. And the reason why the EU knows that Serbia won't join is because of the three reasons we've given you since first. First, in terms of the importance of Kosovo, and it knows that people don't want to sacrifice their national identity. Secondly, in terms of the virtue signaling that the European Union necessarily wants to do from bigger countries like France to want to say that, oh, we're incentivizing better democratic values. But thirdly, in terms of Croatia or Slovenia having this past vengeance in which they want to veto consistently Serbia. And therefore, in order for them to be getting money from the EU, not from Germany, South Korea, they have to necessarily believe that Serbia will be joining, but it won't. That is why South Korea's case is dead. Two then questions I'll be answering in this speech. Firstly, on the Serbian people, and this works independently, even if they get their sweet money from, I guess, I don't know where by the end of your speeches. And secondly, where is the economy actually better? But I just want to note up top very quickly that I think that they've been really unfair. Because under their side, they presumably get to have a little China, and also, like, you know, broadly the EU. But apparently, for some reason, we don't get to have a little Germany in bilateral agreements. I think this is very uncharitable. This is why we told you that you can still have bilateral agreements just as any other country trades. The difference is that Serbia is no longer going to be trying to increase its ties with the EU to try and get that money from the EU, which, by the way, has been decreasing. Serbia has been getting less investment from the EU collectively because it knows it's not going to join. First question then on the Serbian people, and we told you that national identity is the most important thing, which is very, very significantly harmed because the EU keeps screaming to Serbia to recognize Kosovo. We told you that this is bad for a couple of reasons. The first is that they're pressured because it's a prerequisite for EU ties. Your case cannot work unless Serbia concedes. And this is evident when you literally don't try to engage with any of the harms of getting more of that funding and what that would be. But secondly, in terms of the veto of other countries. Thirdly, in terms of big countries just telling Serbia what to do and them seeming very desperate as a nation. But fourthly, in terms of this being against what the Serbian people actually want. All of this sacrifices national identity. They tell you it's not that big a deal. Clearly, it is. Firstly, because it affects more people. It affects literally everyone in the Serbian nation. Secondly, because the harm of a loss of identity and direction of who you are is significantly much larger than the harm of maybe losing on some additional trade or economic relations with more EU countries. But thirdly, in terms of the certainty, we know Serbian people care about this versus 55% of them don't really want ties with the EU anyway. So obviously, in terms of that, we win that. So then they backtrack and they tell you about wealth inequality and human rights abuses. I don't see why the EU cares about Serbian equality at the point where the EU isn't investing in some kind of way to improve that. But secondly, trade relationships have nothing to do with human rights, right? At the point where China establishes trade agreements collectively and builds infrastructure with Serbian people, yes, it has a human rights abuse record, but that has nothing to do with how it invests. So then clearly then, on the Serbian people, we are the ones that protect them. Second question then very quickly on where is the economy better? I give you 5 reasons as to why it is. First, because there's a bigger market than the EU combined, and it's a lot more stable. The EU has been stagnating versus China's doing amazing. Secondly, in terms of China wanting to appeal to other EU countries and therefore being more likely to have a better check mechanism. But thirdly, in terms of the certainty of money, we're more certain to get money rather than the EU, which does make it contingent on the recognition of Kosovo. And they tell you that the EU infrastructure is better, but again, the EU doesn't trade with Serbia. Germany has been giving less and less money. And so under their side, the economy isn't better. We're the ones that get it more in terms of magnitude and in terms of likelihood proposition.